Some of your ancestors probably tried to kill each other. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, so yesterday I put up a video on my Patreon channel for Patreon viewers, link below, which was talking about the William Wallace sword, the so-called William Wallace sword, which I argue stands almost no chance of having been William Wallace's sword. But the point that came up in that was that I like to at least try and point out that I am, I think, unbiased in these questions of nationalism, certainly where England and Scotland is concerned, because I am part Scottish myself, although I have to qualify that statement with the fact that I don't feel really part Scottish, and that's a strange thing, isn't it? Because I know it's very fashionable these days for a lot of people to be doing DNA tests and all this kind of stuff, but what you actually feel, what you feel in terms of, you know, your identity, isn't always married to what your genetics are. And when we actually start talking about genetics and actually when you start looking into it, whether you're researching history and family history from documents, or whether you're actually looking at scientific data that tells you things about your own genetics or those of your family, it kind of reminds you that at the end of the day, we ourselves are not necessarily personally that strongly tied to what went before. So the reason that this came up in the video that I put up about William Wallace's sword is that I am descended from people who almost certainly fought for Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce, of course, fought against the English. Now, whilst I am 1/8 Scottish, it's not a very large amount, but when you actually think about it, 1 in 8 of my ancestors, which of course includes thousands of people, is actually quite a lot of people. My Scottish ancestry is primarily from Ayrshire, around Newton and Prestwich, around there. And in fact, my great-great-grandfather went on to move to Glasgow, as did his brother. They grew up in Newton upon Ayr, and they moved to Glasgow. And my great-great-grandfather was the chief of Glasgow Police in the Victorian period, late Victorian period. And he was a detective in the 1860s and went on to become Chief Constable of Glasgow Police in the 1870s and through to the 1880s. He died in 1888. And his brother was the founder of the Royal Veterinary College in Glasgow. So they were both quite successful individuals in Glasgow. That has no reflection on me. There's no reflected glory here. No, boasting. They were far higher achieving people than I am. And I accept that, okay? They were their own people and very different people to me, incidentally. I should also point that out as well. It's a kind of tangent, but it's worth mentioning. Just because you have an ancestor who did a thing and maybe did something amazing or did something terrible, it's no reflection on you. The sins of the father are not the sins of the son, so to speak. Or equally, the glories of the father are not the glories of the son. I've read court hearing accounts that my great-great-grandfather was a witness or made statements at in his capacity as a policeman, and it's very clear that he was quite a stern individual with strong views on certain subjects, and a very different individual to me. Inevitably, because of course he was a different person to me. The fact that I'm related to him is basically irrelevant, more or less. Right, but coming back to the main point is that they came from Newton upon Ayr, and they were, their father rather, was the claimant of a title which was Freeman of Newton. Now, the Freeman of Newton were a number of freemen who were created, as far as we can tell, in the 14th century under Robert the Bruce, for their services rendered in the wars against the English. Some sources say that it was given after the Battle of Bannockburn, and other sources vary, basically. This is something that I mean to research a bit better. If anyone out there knows anything about the Freeman of Newton and this title, it was passed only from father to eldest son. If you didn't have an eldest son or you didn't have any children at all, then you didn't pass the title on. So there were a certain number of Freemen of Newton, and by the early 19th century, when their father was around, there were far fewer freemen left, but they were the direct male descendants, allegedly, of people who'd fought for Robert the Bruce, and this title is recorded in the Tudor period, so it was definitely around by that point. Right, so if we assume that that's the case, then, and even if the Freeman of Newton title doesn't come from Robert the Bruce's kind of men fighting for him, then indeed, from Newton that is, then indeed, nevertheless, they were Scots living in that area. The fact is that those people fought against the English. Now, it's entirely possible, and in fact I've got hints, I won't go into that, but I've got hints that there were other parts of my English family who fought on the other side, on the English side, during those wars. So quite fundamentally, parts of my English family were enemies of parts of my Scottish family. But this is not unusual. This is completely typical, because when you think about it, even if we just look at the Scottish parts of the family, okay, clearly I have I descend from one Scottish person who's my great-great-grandfather, but they themselves descend from lots of other Scottish people. And if we go back, then inevitably some of his ancestors were enemies of some of his other ancestors, because of course Scotland was divided up. Before it was a unified kingdom, it was divided up into sort of mini princedoms. And equally within those areas there were, clans and family groupings who were enemies of other family groupings. Inevitable. So we don't even need to look at the whole Scottish versus English thing. We can actually just look at Scottish versus Scottish. And famously, the Battle of Culloden 1746, a lot of the English or British forces were actually made up of Scots. We even see this in the American War of Independence, of course. A lot of the redcoats were actually people who'd lived in America, and they were, loyalists. And obviously in more modern times we see something sort of similar to this in Northern Ireland, of course, in the so-called Troubles, where it was Irish against Irish. It wasn't just English, or it wasn't just Protestant versus Catholic. It was Irish versus Irish, as well as English versus Irish, and all kinds of complications. So but coming back to Scotland in the Middle Ages, very clearly, quite famously so, the different groupings in Scotland were often warring at each other. But let's go back to England. I mean, the English, if we go back far enough further back, we have to admittedly go. So England has been a unified kingdom since the late Anglo-Saxon period. But if we go back into the slightly earlier Anglo-Saxon period, if we go back to, say, the 7th, 8th century, Anglo-Saxon England consisted of several kingdoms. The further back we go, the more kingdoms it consisted of. But by the 8th century, I think it was about 6 or 7 kingdoms. The principal ones being Wessex, which was the south, and Kent, which was kind of a bit separate. Mercia, which was basically the Midlands. East Anglia, which is off towards the east, which is Norfolk and Suffolk basically. And then Northumbria, which was the northern part. Interesting point to note, Edinburgh, famous capital city of Scotland, used to be part of England. That it used to be an Anglo-Saxon city. Anyway, that's another point. But so you've got Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex being the big ones, then little East Anglia stuck off to the side, little Kent stuck off to the side, and then I suppose we could say Cornwall as well. And Wales was a separate thing. Wales was the Welsh. And certainly as far as Anglo-Saxon sources are concerned, Wales was a different country and they were different people. Welsh, the word, is actually Anglo-Saxon, meaning foreigner. So if we look at the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, if we read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in the 8th century, for example, for the 8th century rather, because it was written later, in the 9th century, started in the 9th century and then carried on. If we read the Chronicle for the 8th century, we can see continuous war between Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and different of and East Anglia as well, and different of these states, should we call them, kingdoms, allied with each other against the others at different points. I mean, anyone who's watched the series Vikings, historical kind of mess that it is, it does actually give you a sense of this. It gives you a sense of the fact that England was not one kingdom yet. It wasn't England, although they recognised themselves as one people, kind of. Obviously they didn't understand genetics, but kind of genetically they regarded themselves as one people. It was divided up into separate states, separate kingdoms. And we see that, for example, I know that even within my English family, ignoring the Scottish part, within my English family, I have family from Kent and Sussex and around London. I've got family from up in the Midlands near near kind of Chester area. I've got family from Northumbria, from Lindisfarne and up there. So basically I have got Anglo-Saxon family or English family from at least 3 of the different kingdoms of England. So undoubtedly there's a very high chance that at various points some of my ancestors from different bits of England will have tried to kill each other. Now, when people often talk about these kind of national rivalries, they think about, oh, England versus France, or Spain versus Portugal, or Germany versus Russia, or Poland, and things like this. But really, that level of nationalism, actually, if you take it back, it's just kind of ridiculous, because remember that each of these geographic areas are relatively modern inventions, okay? And the further back you go in history, the more likely it is that you're going to find that different groups of your ancestors tried to kill each other. And that's true within England. It's not even just like England versus France. Probably statistically, English people have killed more English people than they have been killed by the French or the Germans or whatever. And same with Germany. Of course, Germany was various different states, and although it was under the Holy Roman Empire for quite a period of time, they were kind of rival states and so on. And you know, I myself have some German ancestry as well. I'm 1/16 German, so that actually goes back to the 19th century. So, but undoubtedly, there are people, I have common ancestors with people who are living in Germany today, okay? And 2 world wars, I'm sure that some of that family and some of this family were sold. I mean, certainly lots of my English family were in the war in World War I, and a couple of them in World War II, and I'm sure the same is true of the Germans as well. So, to sum up, essentially, we've all been trying to kill each other for a really long time. And when you kind of express these things about, oh, the French are the ancient enemy, well, are they? I mean, I'm part Scottish, and the Scots loved the French, the Old Alliance and all that. And, you know, I'm part German, and at various points, the Germans and the French have tried to kill each other, but they've also kind of been on the same side at various points as well. And, you know, my English ancestry, I'm predominantly English, but the 13/16 or something are English, and the English part of my family have undoubtedly all tried to kill each other at various points. The English Civil War, or, you know, Catholic versus Protestant, or the Wars of the Roses, or whatever, you know, we have all of our ancestries have been at war with each other and have been rivals with each other since history began. So really, next time you're kind of viewing another group of people as other or different or the enemy, just remember that. Remember that your very own ancestry, without any shadow of a doubt, your own ancestors at some point have tried to kill each other. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.